All right, we'll continue on with our weather briefings or aviation weather module. Types of weather information. By the way, the reference material here is the FAA Advisory Circular called Aviation Weather Services. It's AC 00-45, and the current one now is 45G. But that's what you'll find if you have questions about aviation weather services, is the provision of weather. That's where you would go for that. But for today, we're just going to go through this module again. We're reviewing in preparation for the written test, so we're trying to focus on the items that would be possibly asked for in the FAA written exam. Right? So we have two different kinds of weather. We have observations, data collected by some kind of a sensor. Much of it in the United States is by automated sensors. But they could be produced through radar, weather radar, satellite. Commercial aviators also will make weather reports as they fly along, possibly called pilot reports. Okay, so anyway, the weather briefers will analyze the information and produce charts and a number of different products. The most common thing for us would be able to call the flight service station, and they'll interpret the weather situation for us if we wish. But we can also go online and do our own interpretation. That's why we have to know how to read these things, because often it's just simpler and easier just to call or to go online and find the information. The other kind of weather information we gain is a forecast, and that's of course developed through modeling and computer generated processes, taking all of these observations put together into some kind of a model of what will happen in the future. There are struggles with that. The further out it gets, the less accurate, of course. But we accept that fact. At least we get some ideas about the weather, the future weather. Right, so observations, raw weather data collected by some type of sensor. Observations can be either in situ in a place or remote. Right, a forecast are the predictions of the development and or movement of weather phenomena based on observations and other mathematical models as well. All right, so we'll start with the weather reports. Let's focus on that. We have aviation routine weather reports, abbreviated METAR. It's the primary observation code used in the United States, and it's a code that's standard. So all over the universe, all over the world, they'll be able to interpret these METARs. It may be automated, indicated by auto in the METAR, and there may be a 01 or a A02. The difference between A1 and A2 is the fact that A1 doesn't have a precipitation discriminator. In other words, it doesn't know what kind of A1 doesn't know what kind of precipitation. Just it is precipitating. Something's falling. Something H2O particles, liquid, frozen, solid. We don't know. It doesn't know. But A2 knows whether it's snow or rain, whatever. And of course, METARs can be an observation made from an air traffic control tower as well. That's put into the METAR format, can be put into the METAR format to be available, right? So you can look at the sectional chart and sort of, if you know there is METAR coming from a particular airport on the chart, how do you tell whether or not it possibly came from a tower or not? You check the color of the airport, right? If it's magenta, it's an uncontrolled airport, then generally speaking, it's going to be automated machine that's observing the weather. But if it's a blue colored symbol on the chart, there's a suggestion that possibly the METAR may be modified by a human being that actually looks out the window and says, okay, the METAR says this, but maybe there's a big bird sitting on the wind direction indicator of the automated machine, and that's not what the wind really is, and that could be corrected. That's unlikely, but it's possible. All right. I'm being a little bit facetious there because that probably doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And possibly a manned aircraft pilot might observe something significant and make a report, and that gets passed on to the weather forecasters and reporters for that matter. So here it is. Here's the format right from the FAA site. Not a big mystery, standard more or less. Okay, in this age of computers, where of course you ask, why don't we just write it out in plain language? Well, because not everybody reads and writes English. So perhaps that's one reason. I don't know. But whatever it is, just live with it. This is how you read it. And this is what you'll need to do for the written test. METAR type of report. Station identifier. Then the date and time of the report. The report modifier, just telling you this is an automated machine. That's telling you the weather. Could say anything there, I suppose. Then the wind block. 220 degrees at 15 knots. That's the wind direction. Is 200 coming from 220 degrees, 15 knots, gusting at 25 knots. Then the 180 verse V250 is telling you the wind is blowing around. It's not just one straight line wind, but it varies back and forth. Variable between 180 coming directly out of the south and out of 250 degrees. So it's sort of a gusty, blustery day out there at Oklahoma City. KOKC is Oklahoma City. Visibility 3/4 of a mile. Remember, statute miles is the visibility. They're telling you runway visual range. We haven't really got into that. That's really not really a issue on the written test for small unmanned aircraft. But there it is. Then we have the present weather. What's it like? The plus means a lot, or even up to extreme. TS, thunderstorms. RA, rain. And I gave you a sheet of paper. I'll attach it to the lesson, to the module here. But to know what these identifiers mean. TS, RA, that makes sense. BR, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Mist. Sky conditions, overcast at 1,000 feet. OVC, 010, 1,000 feet. CB, cumulonimbus clouds. Temperature 18, dew point 16, altimeter 2992, remarks A2. Remember, it's the kind of automated machine that can tell the difference between rain and snow. And then TSB, thunderstorm began at 2:05 past the hour. They don't have to tell you what hour it is because it's an hourly report. METARs are produced every hour. So it's 25 minutes past the previous hour. Right, date and time of the report. 1955 is the time of the report. Well, looking back to 1925, that's when the thunderstorm started thundering. And it's also mentioning TS overhead, thunderstorm overhead, moving towards the east, and then sea level pressure. Right? Pretty simple. Observations, raw weather data collected by some type of sensor. Okay, now we have, of course, weather charts that we've talked about. We have a number of different kinds of surface prognostic chart, which is really handy for knowing what is happening right now. It's still it is a forecast, but it's a graphical interpretation. Really handy if you're going to travel very far, or even to know what may be moving in your direction shortly. Then we have radar summary. It just shows you where the radar returns are coming from, so where the rain is. Satellite imagery, of course, as you've seen that before, which is cloud cover, basically. But also satellites can pick up lightning strikes also. Forecast now, moving on to forecast. Forecast are the predictions of the development and or movement of some kind of weather phenomena based on, of course, observations and models. We have area forecasts and we have terminal area forecast. Area forecast is FA, is designated FA as the identifier for it. So you know when you see FA under a forecast that's what they're talking about. Forecast, an area forecast, right? Terminal area forecast is good for 5 miles around the airport where that report is based. So that earlier one we saw that said Oak City, that was of course a METAR, But if there was a forecast there, it'd say Oak City, and we would know that that's the weather forecast for that 5-mile diameter circle around that particular airport. Well, we might live quite a ways from an airport that has a terminal area forecast, so then we want to look at the area forecast, which covers a larger area. Obviously, going to be slightly less accurate, perhaps, but that's for a larger area. That gives you the idea. And, this takes trained technicians to analyze all these weather products. And yes, we use computer programs to do this. They look at the global weather patterns, and they come up with these charts. And these charts aren't just used for drone pilots, of course not. All pilots, manned aircraft, unmanned aircraft, but also truck drivers, not truck drivers, but the dispatchers probably are directing their vehicles according to the kinds of weather that they might encounter, or at least they'll be able to make allowances for the fact that it's going to be a little bit slower to drive from point A to point B if it's blinding rainstorms or hurricanes or whatever. Sea as well. Boats at sea, shipping at sea is involved and needs these forecasts and reports as well. Disaster planners, the road department. Do you ever think about the guys that got to plow the snow off the roads? Somebody in that department is checking the weather forecast to see what kind of weather to predict. Do I need a load of sand at the interstate? Probably not if it's going to be a clear day. So they're very useful, used over a number of different industries. Very important part of the National Airspace System and providing for many other departments as well. Okay, here's an example of area forecast. Okay, there for the southeast section, you can see the sort of an orange-colored area. That's an area forecast, covers that whole area. So there can be some vast difference between North Carolina and South Florida. So, they're trying their best to give you and look at the Salt Lake City forecast covers the southern part of Arizona and New Mexico all the way up to the upper part of Montana. A vast difference throughout that whole area, but they do a pretty good job. Gives you a good idea of what might be happening in your particular area. And of course, you note that we can get it at aviationweather.gov. We'll produce all these different charts periodically. They have expiration times, they have starting times, and whatnot. Okay. So we have area forecast. We just talked about that. And we have terminal area forecast. And we have, TAF is for terminal area forecast. We have different, not really different kinds, but the terminal area forecast is designated TAF. But we have TAF amended. So we have an area forecast good for a period of time, and then it may be amended because things have rapidly changed, or maybe they made a mistake. Maybe there was some data they didn't have. They need to amend it and say, well, you know what, we think maybe. And then they also may have a corrected one, TAF corrected one, or COR. So you'll see those designators on the forecast. Really not much significance for someone that wants to know what the weather is forecast to be. It mustn't make much difference. But that may be a question. So questions will be asked on the written test, like this particular one here. Go to figure 22 of the testing supplement, spot number 2, and the question will read something like, where would you get the local weather? And what they're suggesting here is to look for the AWOS frequency. Let's see, what color shall I use? I'll use red. All right, so we find the box associated. Say we're up here at the number 2, by the way. They may be asking you that. You may look down here and you see AWOS frequency 135.075. That's the AWOS, Automated Weather Observation System. So it's a recording going over and over and over with the weather at that particular airport. So if we're flying up in the area, we have a radio that we can listen to. We can monitor what the weather is at that airport. So they may ask that question. What is the weather? How would you find out the weather at the Coeur d'Alene Airport? Now, of course, if you look at the chart supplement US, for that particular airport, there will be a telephone number which will get you the same recording. So for a drone, it's a lot handier for a drone pilot to be able to know what the number is, the phone number is, and just call them up and listen to the same recording, because who carries a radio around? Chances are you don't carry a radio around to listen to that. So if we were in class today, I'd have you dial that number, by the way, the number, and try it. What the heck? Why not? Coeur d'Alene, I looked it up earlier, and the phone number is 208-772-8215. And right now you can find the current weather. Whenever you listen to this recording, you can find out the forecast, or not, correction, the actual weather report for Coeur d'Alene Airport. 208, just in case, 772-8215. That's the weather report there. That's just a tip. Maybe helpful to you someday that you'll know that you can look that up. That gives you the continuously transmitted automated weather report. To make a METAR, they just take one of those an hour to produce those reports. Again, that's only good for this airport within 5 miles. And so sometimes we do need weather for a larger area, and that's why we can get more information from calling flight service station or using the area forecast. There's several different ways we can call these flight service stations. Remember, those are the lonely guys in this room somewhere in the United States. Not really sure where they are. I guess I could look it up if I was really curious, but they're sitting in a room. They're reviewing weather. They're in contact with other forecasters as well, and they're accumulating all this weather information, waiting for pilots, whether drone pilots or manned aircraft pilots, or dispatchers, to call them up and ask what the weather is. So they're waiting for people to call you, their employees, just waiting for you to call. So don't feel bad about calling. That's the number. Just call them up. Of course, they're going to want to know who you are, where you are, and what in the world you're doing, or why are you asking. They're going to want some information about that in order to give you a good weather report, right? Okay, so flight service communicates directly with pilots for pilot briefings, flight plans as well. They also have radio frequencies that they can listen and give in-flight weather as well. If you were in a manned aircraft flying along, you could listen. We could call them up on the radio frequency and ask them what the weather was like, and they can give it to you then too. They also dispense notices to airmen. Okay, so they've got the latest notice to airmen right there in front of them. You ask them where you are and you tell them where you are and what you're going to do, where you're going to be going. They can give you advice about, oh, a NOTAM just popped up about a TFR. You're prohibited from flying there. Good to know. They do not provide air traffic control services. They don't clear people for takeoff and landing. They are not able to give hotel and restaurant and fuel prices for specific airports. They are specifically for weather information, NOTAMs. They do make reports on missing aircraft when you have a flight plan, so they can be used in an emergency for emergency situations. But pilot briefings, that's their game. Brief the pilots on the weather and the airspace. Very handy. Different. Okay. Oh yeah, you can get it on the www.1800weatherbrief.com as well. The handy thing about doing that, there's a procedure for logging in and registering your name and the fact that you're a drone pilot, and it will tailor the information you get from that for your particular operation. Plus the fact it is proof that you did what the FAA says you must do. Drone pilots, as well as manned aircraft pilots, must always check all available resources before they fly, and all available resources includes the weather. So if you have an accident and it's somehow related to the fact the weather wasn't what it was supposed to be, and you didn't check the weather, that may be a possible violation. So this is proof that you did check the weather, even if something happened that was unexpected, which happens sometimes. When we make that phone call, right, this is an important part, and there's questions on this in the FAA as well. Do you want a standard brief, you want an abbreviated brief, or you want an Outlook brief? Okay, and don't confuse this. Standard brief is what you normally get when you're getting ready to go flying. An abbreviated brief, if you've got a standard brief and the next morning or the next couple hours you get delayed or something like that, you get a standard brief. Let's say you get a standard briefing in the morning before you go flying. You get out to the airport and things get delayed and it turns out to be 3 hours later. You can call them up and ask for an abbreviated brief, and they won't give you everything. They'll just give you what changed since the time you had a standard brief. That's the best way to put it. Now, the day before you're thinking about going flying, you talk to your customer, and they say, well, I want you to go over the house. I want you to fly. Well, you say, okay, let me check and get some information before I get back to you, because you want to know what the weather's going to be like. If it's going to be raining, you're not going to get good pictures. So you get an Outlook brief. What's it going to be like tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the afternoon? Yes, the weather briefer. So Outlook is something for way out in the future or in the next day, something like that. Just give me an idea of what it's going to be like. I don't need all the super details, but I want to know if it's going to be good enough to take these photographs or whatever the project is. And then you call the customer back up and say, okay, well, it's forecast to rain tomorrow. Can I do it Thursday? Whatever, That's the basic idea for these different kinds of briefs. So the question will be like, if you want to know an update from a previous briefing, what kind of briefing would that be called? An abbreviated briefing, because you've already got a briefing. When you call the briefer, you're supposed to tell them who you are. In other words, what kind of aircraft. That's what they're really interested in. Are you flying a 747 or are you flying a Mavic Mini? Okay, they want to know what airplane you're flying and where you are and what you're intending to do. That's the kind of things that they need to know in order to give you a good briefing. Okay, and this is that regulation that I mentioned before. CFR 14-107-49, pre-flight familiarization, inspection, and actions for aircraft operation. It says very specifically, Part 107 says, prior to flight, the remote pilot and command must assess the operating environment, consider risks to persons and property in the immediate vicinity, both on the surface and in the air. This assessment must include local weather conditions, local airspace, and any flight restrictions. That's why we're doing this course, not only to pass the FAA written test, but also so that you can be a safe pilot and be able to obey this. If you don't know anything about the weather, you don't know anything about airspace, how are you going to do this? Over here on the side, it's just a picture of flightservice.com, another very handy place to find weather information as well. There's a bigger blow up there. I find this really handy. It's well laid out. 1-800 weather brief's great, but this is just another place to access the weather. So we have forecasts, advisories, forecasts, observations, user tools, a lot of information here. You just need to explore this. This, generally speaking, is not going to be on the written test, but it's just